Hello, good evening from London, or good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're watching from. My name's Jonathan Boyd. I'm the Executive Director of JPR, the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this event, jointly sponsored by us at JPR and by the ASSJ, the Association for the Social Scientific Study of Jewry, an organisation that I'm proud to serve on as a board member, and that is the international body that brings together researchers and academics from multiple disciplines involved in understanding the state of contemporary Jewish life, many of whom I believe are watching today. JPR is an independent research institute that specialises in generating data to support community planning for Jewish communities across Europe. And there's probably no issue that engages us more than tonight's topic, Jewish identity, who Jews are and how they understand and live their Jewishness in today's world. We have a brilliant collection of scholars involved in today's event, including, first of all, the world's leading expert in Jewish demography, Professor Sergio DellaPergola from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who also serves as the chair of JPR's European Jewish Demography Unit. Sergio is also the author of the report that we will be using as our jumping off point today, The Jewish Identities of European Jews, a new study published by us at JPR that provides what, to my mind, is the most in-depth and multifaceted quantitative study of Jewish identity in Europe that I've ever seen. The report, though, also looks at Jewishness in its broader global context, drawing some thought-provoking comparisons between Jews in Europe and Israel and the United States, which will ensure that our conversation is very much an international one. To support that, Sergio is joined by Professor Judit Bokser-Liwerant, the Professor of Political Science at the Universidad Nacional Autonoma de Mexico, where she is the Director of the Graduate School of Political and Social Sciences. She also serves as the current president of the ASSJ, continually helping to ensure that researchers and academics involved in studying contemporary Jewish life are learning from one another and pushing one another to think more deeply and carefully about our work. Her expertise lies in the study of collective identities, in contemporary Latin American Jewry, and in political theory, and we're really delighted that she's chosen to join us this evening. To bring an American perspective, we're also joined by Professor Harriet Hartman, Professor of Sociology at Rowan University in New Jersey, who's also the long-standing editor of the journal Contemporary Jewry, which is the main outlet for scholarly work on Jewish life today. Harriet's brilliantly insightful work in the States and indeed in Israel has focused on a variety of aspects of Jewish identity, with particular focus on understanding the roles of family, gender, and diversity, and we're thrilled that she's with us today. Last but not least, we have Dr. Daniel Staetsky, the director of our European Jewish Demography Unit at JPR, who grew up in the Soviet Union before making Aliyah and working for several years at Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics, followed by a spell at RAND Europe. He's been at JPR for close to 10 years now, specializing in Jewish demography, social statistics, survey methodology, and anti-Semitism, and he co-authored our new study on European Jewish identity, which we will be looking at today. A quick word or two about the format of the event. In a moment, I'm going to invite Sergio to give a 15-minute presentation on some of the key findings from that study to help kick off the discussion. Harriet, Judit, and I will then be sharing our own thoughts on some of the findings and posing our own questions to Sergio and Daniel. So we'll spend the first hour or so discussing the issues raised in the research between the five of us. But if you would like to ask a question to any of us, we have a great mechanism for that. In the top corner of the screen, you will see a QR code. All you need to do is open the camera on your phone, hold it up to the code, tap on the screen on your phone, and that will take you to an application called Slido, where you can both type in your own questions and, importantly, vote on those posed by others. And the most popular questions will rise to the top based on your votes, and I'll do my best to ask those. Our brilliant tech partners today at Shock Audio will put the QR code up on the screen periodically through the event, so feel free to use it at any time. And if you haven't used it before, I think you will enjoy doing so. If you don't have a phone to hand, you can simply go to slido.com, enter the code 839969, and access the system that way. That's 839969, and it's Slido, slido.com. But let's get going. We only have an hour and a half, so let me hand over to my colleague, Professor Sergio DellaPergola, to share some of the insights that have come out of our new study of Jewish identity in Europe. Over to you, Sergio.
Thank you, John. Good evening from Jerusalem, and a good day to you all. It's a fast-changing world, and unfortunately, we see these last weeks very sad events in Eastern Europe. And we ask permanently the questions of the existence, the permanence, the quality, the transmission of Jewish identity. In reality, Jewish identities, as we shall see tonight. Just an opening sentence in general, we have this perception of a continuum, sort of linear continuum between a very strong and a very weak, a very persisting or a vanishing Jewish identity, as also reflected in much of the recent literature. But this is a quite superficial outlook. The situation is much more complex and more interesting, as I hope we shall demonstrate tonight. So we have a little PowerPoint presentation, and I am asking now the technician to mount it. The theme of this conversation is Jewish identities, note the plural today, concepts, measurements, and realities. The next slide shows the next slide, please, shows the cover of the report upon which this talk is based. It's a recently released publication of over 100 pages, big format, The Jewish Identities of European Jews, What, Why, and How. In fact, we are hinting here at the multi-dimensionality of this cluster of ideas, of norms, of behaviors, of institutions, and of many other things that characterizes the true essence of Judaism. The report was co-authored by me and my colleague, Dr. Daniel Staetsky, who is present here tonight. And so let's move to some of the fundamentals of the report, moving to the next slide. The next slide, please, says Jewish identity, no simple linear relation. And then let's move to the next slide, which tries to catch very simply one of the modes of representing the initial complexity of Jewish identity. In fact, there are three main dimensions that perhaps popularly we have called the what, the why, and the how of being Jewish. The what refers to the basic definition of what is Judaism for you. Is your religion, it's your ethnicity, maybe parentage, culture, and heritage that you have received or you have achieved yourself through your choice. The why alludes to the motivation for being Jewish. What are the main contents that engage you? Memory of the Shoah, or combating anti-Semitism, believing in God, being a member of your community, supporting Israel, and other aspects. These are the basic contents of the topic. And then the third is the how, your personal life. What are the choices you make in terms of faith, but also your interactions, choosing your peers with whom you meet and you work together. Haredi, Orthodox, what's Reform or Progressive, or simply just Jewish. And in sometimes, more often today, mixed, that is, being partly Jewish and partly something else. The fact is that each of these fields or domains should not be seen in separation, but also in the overlaps that exist between them. And that's perhaps the most interesting part of the total. So let's move to the next field, to the next, which addresses what is Jewishness. So let's review first this first domain. Next slide. Judaism is multidimensional, as noted, and should be understood in all of its complexity. In our survey, by the way, let's not forget two things. We are speaking tonight fundamentally about the Jews of Europe. We are talking about Jews in 12 countries in the European Union, including the UK, which at the time of the survey, 2018, was still a member. And then another thing that for fair disclosure, we should not forget, this is a survey that was conceived initially to report about perceptions of anti-Semitism. The rich material we get about Jewish identity and about demography and other aspects is a bonus we get from the main survey, and it is sufficiently detailed to let us analyze quite in depth the situation. So we find that among those who give a single answer about the question of what is Judaism for you, how it defines your pertainance to Judaism, religion is preferred, followed by parentage, culture, heritage, ethnicity quite low in Europe, unlike perhaps Israel or other places. But if you consider that there were multiple options to answer this question, in fact, religion is no more number one, rather parentage and culture and also heritage slightly are the three prime answers, followed by religion. Again, ethnicity is the lowest and upbringing in between. Let's notice that some of these options involve active participation by the respondents, choices and behaviors and networks, whereas others are rather passive. That is, upbringing is something I did not decide. Perhaps I didn't either decide about who my parents were and what they decided to do with my education. So we have this complex interaction between religion and other ways of being Jewish, which is clearly outlined by this data. The next slide shows how these propensities change across age groups. There is a very interesting and perhaps surprising dynamics here, in the sense that vis-a-vis nearly all of the options, the younger persons tend to give more answers. I remind that this was a multiple answer question, and on all accounts, more answers were obtained by the younger. And what perhaps stands out already at this stage is that religion and parentage are those who are more rapidly growing among the younger vis-a-vis the others, but everything seems to be more relevant, perhaps unexpectedly, among the younger segment of the Jewish population. Now, the next slide demonstrates how the patterns of being Jewish interact with one fundamental aspect, and that the degree of religiosity as expressed in the survey. And we find basically two things. One is that, not unexpectedly, religion is much more relevant among the Haredi and the Orthodox, that is, those who say they are Haredi and Orthodox, than among the others. And then it declines very significantly among those who say, I'm just Jewish, or none of these, or mixed Jewish and non-Jewish. But vis-a-vis most of the others with relatively minor changes, all of the options are rather stable all across the spectrum of religiosity, which is already a beginning to show how certain things, perhaps apparently contradictory or even incompatible, can live together in the complex stratification of Jewish identity. Now let's move to the second domain. The second domain in the next slide is, why are we Jewish? What are the issues, the topics that concern me the most? The next slide gives the basic description. In the first place, remembering the Holocaust and combating anti-Semitism. This is perhaps no surprise, as we shall see also by further comparisons later in this session. Feeling part of the Jewish people, and then with diminished intensity, those aspects which are more related to religiosity, like Jewish festivals, believing in God, which is quite low in the hierarchy, supporting Israel in between. The question is asked in terms of very significant, in terms of defining your Jewish identity. And we find that, again, Holocaust and anti-Semitism are clearly dominant, whereas the more religious aspects are quite at the bottom of the range. The next slide demonstrates the same, looking at the generational diversity, passing from the older to the younger. And here we see clearly, if we observe the data, that certain patterns are relatively stable across the ages, but there are one or two which are definitely growing, and it's the more religious aspects of Jewish identity. that is celebrating Jewish festivals with the family, and believing in God. Believing in God is nearly doubling from those who are 70 plus to those who are 16 to 29. And it's an intriguing aspect of something that we can define on the one hand as return, on the other hand, perhaps as greater polarization within the community. We shall discuss that later. The next slide confirms basically what in part we have already seen. The more religious aspects are, of course, absolutely essential and central on the more religious part of the range. The Haredi and the Orthodox, of course, think that that is not unexpectedly think that believing in God and also celebrating the festivals, but also significantly donating to charity are very essential parts of their Jewish identity. Whereas the other aspects are rather stable, notably remembering the Holocaust and combating anti-Semitism, which have only mild variation across the whole spectrum of religiosity, and which appears to be the real backbone of this looking at Jewish identity in Europe. There are other aspects which are also somewhat sensitive to religiosity. We notice especially that support for Israel is stronger on the more religious part of the range, not exactly among the Haredi, but certainly among the Orthodox and the traditional, and then declines somewhat among the others. And the same can be said, interestingly, also feeling part of the Jewish people, which is more associated with religiosity than with the weaker religious part of the Jewish community. We now move to the next slide, which returns to the aspect of how is Jewishness expressed in terms of personal behaviors, beliefs, and also associations. And here we find something which is quite central in our findings. The single largest category, again, we are speaking of 12 countries in the European Union, which by themselves are quite different in the north, in the south, in the west, and in the east of the continent. But then we find that just Jewish is the relatively the strongest option, followed by traditional. Those more clearly identified with a denomination, such as Haredi Orthodox on the one hand and Reform Progressive on the other hand, do not represent altogether more than 1/3 of the total. That is, most Jews like to define themselves outside of strictly formal denominational lines, and they express certain interest or lifestyle which may range from traditional to just Jewish. Of course, the weakest part, none of these, means basically nothing, and mixed also means that it's difficult for someone who is only partly Jewish to identify with the more formally structured Jewish organizational system. Let's move to the next, which next slide again demonstrate the variation of the process of identification along religious lines by age. We find, once again, we have already noted this, that the more religious options are growing. Look at the Orthodox and the Haredi. They have a small minority of the total, but this small minority has more than doubled between the older and the youngest segment of the Jewish population. And this has gone very largely at the expense of just Jewish. That is, it looks like there is a need among Jews in Europe to define themselves more clearly ideologically, moving away from that sort of gray zone of just Jewish and reaching a congregation or an organization which is more ideologically specific. The other options, like traditional, fairly stable, although somewhat declining among the younger, and also none of these is not growing. In other words, this is a picture certainly of a community which is not disappearing nor assimilating. There is a sense of a return of the stronger options. And this is an interesting message, to some extent not expected in our work. Let's move to the next slide, which exemplifies some of the most well-known rituals in the Jewish calendar. And here we find something which is, I think, well known from previous research. Clearly, the winner is the Passover Seder, most or all years, with nearly three quarters of the total Jewish population answering affirmatively, followed at distance by the Yom Kippur fast, most or all years, and then moving down to lighting candles on a Friday night, eating kosher at home, attending synagogue, often not switching lights on the Shabbat, which is, of course, a stronger and more formal way of observing traditional Judaism, whereas none of these is limited to less than 20% of the total, meaning that the vast majority of the Jews do something with different incidences, which once again we can check in the next slide. The next slide shows the variation by age. We see consistently with previous findings that nearly all of the rituals tend to become more accepted and more frequent among the younger generation, really a finding which absolutely contrasts with a certain perception of the weakening of Jewish life in Europe and in the world, whereas those who do not anything of the above is clearly declining, and it's in fact a very small proportion of the youngest segment. And then we have the next slide, which sort of intersects the behaviors with the self-declared pertainance to an ideological stream. And here we find something quite interesting. First of all, not unexpectedly, the Haredi and the Orthodox tend to be very consistent in their nearly full observance of all of the possible rituals, 100% or nearly so on most, just a slightly lower percent on attending synagogue weekly or more often, which can be related to aging and lesser mobility, but overall high, consistent, and complete. All of the other groups tend to have a declining pattern from those rituals that are more popular and followed, like attending the Passover Seder to the minimum, or do not switching lights on the Shabbat, which means a very consistent Shabbat observance. And what is perhaps interesting is the intermediate line. You see there is a dotted line in the mid of the slide, which is the 50%. And we can find what is the type of persons who do, a majority of whom do at least some, if not all, of the rituals. For example, attending Seder is good for the Orthodox, the traditional, the Reform, and the just Jewish. The others do not reach 50%. But then fasting Yom Kippur declines for the just Jewish. Lighting candles declines for the Reform and Progressive. And attending synagogue declines for the traditional. And finally, not switching lights on Shabbat is really something for the specialists, although I will also say it's not zero. Here we have one of the most fascinating findings in our research, and that is each of the groups does something, sometimes unexpectedly. So you have the most secular of them all who does not switch on lights on the Shabbat, and perhaps you find very few singular cases of Orthodox who cannot attend the Seder or cannot even fast on Yom Kippur, probably due to age and health problems. And this makes the whole equation much more interesting, because these are real people reporting on their real life, not only models and theories, but a behavior which reflects the complexity and the richness of possibilities that exist in contemporary Jewish life. I think the next slide concludes this initial presentation. So I return the line to the studio in London for the continuation of this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Sergio. Really appreciate lots of interesting stuff there. I'm actually going to hand straight over to Judit, who I think is going to respond initially. So over to Judit. You need to unmute, Judit.
You are muted. You are muted.
Sorry. Yeah. It's just willing to transmit my thoughts without a voice. Sorry. So hello to everyone from Mexico. I said so. Good morning, good evening, and because I am the first to start this conversation, I would like to congratulate this excellent and thorough research, which delves into the central questions of Jewish identities, their continuity and transformations, internal differentiations, divergent symbols of identification, and differences in the meaning ascribed to them, as well as the reality and hope of an enduring dialogues and debates. What we see in this truly rich research is that the present recovers and reshapes old and new historical conditions. Religion coexists with secularization processes, as we just listened to the presentation of DellaPergola, Sergio. Peoplehood develops hand in hand with national existence. Jewish belonging and civic commonalities reaffirm one another, and amidst the coexistence of individualization processes and collective affirmation, belonging interacts with assimilation trends, while new forms of cohesiveness find and seek to find way into the private and public realm of a diversified Jewish existence. This is indeed a broad study in which both, and I want to underline this, conceptualization and empirical research are guides to the systematic analysis that highlights precisely what we just saw as a bottom. Complexity, multidimensional, non-linearity, and disjuncture and contradiction of the fascinating and challenging world of Jewish identities in the plural. I want to start again recognizing the richness of the conception of what you define as the predicament of Jewish identity, that systematically differentiated and related in the spheres of domains of the why, of the how, of the what, starting with the what, the why, and the how. So multiple and sometimes conflicting options. And then I would, before posing to you one of the several questions that I would like just to pose in order to understand and let our public or assistant to this session to be familiar with it, just mention that here we have content and structures, interactions and borders that define the collective Jewish identities, and in turn are defined by them. So what we saw is that both primordial and symbolic referents derive from a wide cultural spectrum and never must be seen as unitary, indivisible, or organic, but always an assemblage of ideas, elements, patterns, beliefs, behaviors, and this is what your research poses without doubt. So, entering the queries and quandaries of this richness, I would like to ask you first, one of the first questions is that this gamut of Jewish identity that has emerged, that dynamically inhabit an increasingly differentiated space, are still resting on shared basic elements that allows us to refer to all of them as Jewish identities. So, do they still rest on this? This is a very important contribution of this research, because elaborating on the concept of family resemblance of Wittgenstein, that meaning that there is a complicated network of similarities but divergences, overlapping and crisscrossing. So we see in your analysis a shared Jewish condition despite identity difference. So what I would like to see and ask you to elaborate more is, even that we are accustomed historically that even they don't furnish similar answers to the basic questions of identity, they must at least address the same questions. So, provided we don't consider them alien to one another. So, in today's changing world, Jews may not only formulate different answers to the same question, but may also ask different questions. And this is what we may perceive in your research. The place and the role of Judaism, different dimension, and the various meaning may shape precisely this continuity and this unity. So the risk of diversity that we face may become fractured, a fragmented reality. But then, as you posed, this fragmented reality has no a majority of a lifetime or a domination. So I would like to hear more on the impact of the different axes on this diversity, just willing to understand both the dynamics of identity and the spaces where the identities act or interact. Meaning by that, that identities are not free floating. So you worked on Europe, you work on the different countries, on the regional, the national, the horizon of the global. So here I'll stop in my first question and willing to listen to you, right?
Thank you, Judith. Thank you very much. Let me say, first of all, that I understand the peculiarity of the European situation, but I also believe there is a number of lessons that can be applied to a broader realm globally. Perhaps we shall return to some comparisons later. But there are two things that I think emerge from this. First of all, I will confess that personally I've been a little bit surprised by some of the findings. I am known as someone who is usually labeled among the pessimists. I totally reject, by the way, the dialectics, optimism, pessimism. I think it's not appropriate to use that. But certainly in some of my earlier writings, I pointed to certain processes of weakening of the Jewish component of society, which I don't think we find in this specific report. However, one must pay attention to two types of dissonance that do exist. And I think they are also very important later for maybe policy conclusions. One is the dissonance between demography and identity. Unquestionably, the number of Jews has diminished in Europe, and this has happened fundamentally because of immigration, but also to some extent because of an internal erosion due to aging and due to sort of drifting out and quote unquote assimilating within a society, maybe more abruptly in Europe than in other parts of the world. So this is a fact. There are today fewer Jews in Europe than in the past, and part of it is also the product of a weakening of identity. The second type of dissonance is probably between the individual and the institutional system. I would argue that what we find in our study is much more interesting and lively than the complex of Jewish organizations that supposedly represent those Jews. And this is something that points to kind of a time gap. That is, the real people go faster than the institutions. They do things and understand and modify and create and innovate in ways that the institutions are not capable of doing at the same pace. And so this is also probably a tentative initial conclusion about the institutional system, which nevertheless plays a crucial role in maintaining associated Jewish life. Having said that, there are, of course, a number of broader conclusions. And as you mentioned, the fact that many people can do many different things and yet being Jewish, and to some extent they recognize each other while recognizing diversity. The truth is that there are certain patterns, and I will repeat them now shortly. The patterns sometimes cause also a lot of internal strife and disagreement, and this is one of the big problems that we have to confront in contemporary organized Jewish life. But unquestionably, first of all, there are three basic positive parameters in contemporary Jewish identity. I would define them religion, peoplehood, and memory/culture. That is, there are three major modes of being Jewish. And of course, fundamentally, most people do something of each of them, but each of them has an independent life and has to be understood as such. It has certain requirements, certain assumptions, and certain developments which are not identical. And to some extent, they may also be contrasting. And then there is a second way, partly overlapping, that would say the strictly observant, the modern, and the marginal. That is, the strictly observant still wishes to keep the full paradigm of the commandments and of the normative behaviors. The normal recognize the need of a paradigm of normative behaviors, but would like to innovate and to adjust some of them to the modernity of contemporary society. And the marginal is not so interested. That person is probably vaguely associated. However, and this is, I think, a fundamental lesson of our study, that person can be reconducted to a meaningful Jewish identity by the circumstances of society, because Jews do not operate in a vacuum, and they are fundamentally affected by social movements, ideas, political parties, and transformations in society, which tend to bring some of them to get more distant, but also many of them to get closer to the sources of Jewish life and Jewish identity. I think what we may have documented is a significant process of return under the conditions of a Europe where, again, reminding us of the fundamental purposes of this study, the patterns of anti-Semitism and the perception of a growing danger and hostility and uneasiness in terms of social life, culture, and politics may have conducted many Jews who are very peripheral and distant to find some warmth, a home, a community to interact with and to be part of. And so probably this is manifested in different ways. Some of the people can do it through a stronger accent on religious ritual, others in more secular ways. But this is a process which I think is noticeable in Europe, with local differences, of course. I think it's not a stranger to other areas such as Latin America. And to some extent, we see that also in Israel. So I would stop here and return to you.
Thank you, Sergio. Let's move on. But just for those people who didn't hear at the beginning or weren't here at the very beginning, if you want to ask a question, the way to do that is you'll see a QR code in the top right-hand corner of your screen. Open your camera, point it at the QR code, tap on the screen, and it'll take you to Slido identitiestoday.com, and you can type in your question there, and those questions are coming through to me, and we will get to them a little bit later on in the event. But I want to move on by asking a question, or I guess talking about an issue that that relates in some way to sampling. Who's in this sample in the study? Like, who exactly did we survey here? And that might sound like a purely technical methodological question, and it is to a certain extent, but I also think it touches on something much deeper that goes to the very heart of any discussion of Jewish identity, namely who is a Jew and who should be included in or excluded from the community. And Sergio, your most well-known work is in the realm of Jewish demography, and I think it actually touches directly on this issue, because when you assess the size of a Jewish population, you typically provide different counts depending on the definition of Jewish you're using. So, for example, in Ukraine, a country that's very much on all of our minds at the moment, the number of people who currently self-identify as Jewish is just over 40,000. But the number of people who live in a household in which there's at least one Jewish person broadly understood is more like 140,000. And in the United States, the equivalent figures in your latest research are about 6 million and 11.5 million. And of course, in the real lived world, the issue of determining who is and is not Jewish can be deeply personal, particularly in our times when such a high premium is placed on inclusivity. But at the same time, Judaism has traditionally drawn quite a sharp line between who is and isn't Jewish. And for many within the Jewish world today, particularly perhaps in the more orthodox parts of it, that distinction remains very important. So I guess my question is, when you report that X% of European Jews attend a Passover Seder, for example, or Y% identify as Jewish by religion, what definition of Jewish are we using here? And I would say more generally, and perhaps this is a follow-up question, perhaps directed at Harriet, given your work, although others should obviously feel free to comment. How should we as researchers be grappling with this issue of definitions and inclusiveness and exclusiveness?
So I will shortly say, though then I'd like Dr. Daniel Staetsky to comment more thoroughly about how the survey was done and who and how was included. But at this moment, I will only say this. The survey was done in a way in which people were initially asked to define themselves as Jewish. There was a screen in which the question said, are you Jewish by this, that, and that other criterion? We specified several criteria. And if so, please continue. If not, thank you very much. And so this is a sort of flexible definition. It is not really comparable with the definitions that we give in terms of Jewish population estimates. It is not, of course, a strictly halachic definition. Sociologically, as I said already, it includes people who define themselves partly Jewish. They were included in this survey, although there weren't that many. But now this is the slide on which perhaps my friend Daniel would like to continue explaining how the survey was done, and therefore what are some of the implications for its credibility.
Thank you. Thank you. Perhaps I'd say a few words about, let's frame it in scientific terms first, and then in normal human terms later. How the sample is built is another way of saying, is the survey credible? Is it reliable? Is it trustworthy? And that's a primary question that will be asked by analysts, scientists, but also by the general public, by all users of this particular survey. And before I explain how the sample was built, I will probably say a few words about the gold standard of survey research. When we want to survey population, any population at all, what we create as a gold standard, what we demand of ourselves, is to create a random sample of people. So we give effectively each person in the given population an equal and known chance to be included in the survey. This is the gold standard, and as any gold standard, it's quite difficult to live up to the standard, and that's why us, and not just us, many people in the survey world today take shortcuts. Now, the main task for me now and for many methodologists is to explain the gap between the gold standard and the shortcuts that they take, and whether or not still we believe in the data that we collected. So what we did in this particular case is we didn't take a random sample of Jews. So we could not create a situation where every single Jewish individual in any country that we covered had an equal chance to be included in the survey, simply because this particular technique is very demanding. It demands that we have full list of all Jewish individuals, and that's not something that we could have. What we did instead is we turned to a variety of Jewish organizations across the entire spectrum of religiosity, age groups, interests, in all countries that we surveyed. And we surveyed Jewish communities in 12 countries. And we asked those Jewish organizations to send invitations to the survey on our behalf to all those Jews who could be reached by them, i.e., those Jewish individuals who were present on their membership and affiliation lists. And subsequently, when this first cohort of people received the survey, we asked those people to refer survey further to their friends and acquaintances who were known to be Jewish to them. That is effectively how it worked. Now, I would like to present the first slide from part 2, which shows the process, not the outcome, but the process of this the process of this particular method of surveying. So effectively, the reality we tried to create is that basically to census every single individual on the membership affiliation list of every single organization, Jewish organization in Europe. And then we asked them to refer survey further. Whilst the survey was in the field, we could monitor the performance of the survey. We could see whether our instructions worked and what kind of results they generated. And in this slide, what you see is the channels of access, what people actually said to us. Every single respondent in the survey was asked the question, how did you come to answer this survey? How did you learn about its very existence? 66%, which is 2/3, told us that they received an email from an organization. That's hardly surprising, because that's how we started. That's the core from which we started our survey. And the rest received it through a referral process. Majority were told by somebody, or somebody sent them a link. They saw it in a newspaper, they saw it in an advert. But anyhow, this didn't come from our core attempt to email people on membership lists of an organization. The reason I'm highlighting this slide, the reason that it's a gratifying slide in a way, is because we could see that a significant minority of people don't come from the core Jewish community. The Jewish community, the part of the Jewish community that is easiest for us to reach, because these are simply people who are very involved in Jewish life. One accusation or suspicion that could be raised against the survey is because you start with Jewish organizations, we could have ended in a situation where we have a file, a sample that includes very involved people. That is not so, simply because our survey spread via referrals, and statistical theory tells us that when that starts happening, the survey goes into the field to the more marginal parts of the Jewish population, to the less affiliated individuals. So an utmost effort was made to generate this referral process that would bring the margins into the picture. And now you can ask me, and justifiably so, well, you showed us the process, but how do you actually know that this process worked? How do you know? And the answer to that is that is a way to control and see how we're performing. We included in our survey a number of questions which we asked the respondents to understand which corners of Jewish community they come from. Part of this data you saw already. We included the question on denomination to make sure that all denominations, all shades and colors of religiosity and Jewish lifestyle are reflected in the survey. But we also asked questions on educational level, on age, on sex. This is partly to inform us about ourselves, about the composition of Jewish population. But the second aim of these questions, and second goal behind asking these questions, was to see how we are performing. So not only we made an effort, but we documented the outcome. What we can say as a result is that on many characteristics, the sample that we received, which is 16,000 people strong, was rather closely aligned with known characteristics of Jewish population on matters such as sex, age, denominational composition, educational composition, and other characteristics, geographical composition. So we have a very good representation, as we would expect, of Jewish populations in different countries. When we could see that actually our survey deviates from the expected, from what we call benchmarks, from the known, well-established facts picture of Jewish population, we could correct ourselves, and we did it by using what's called in statistical jargon weights, where we simply adjusted the survey to some extent to be closer to the expected distributions. Having done so, and having compared our weighted results with unweighted results, uncorrected results to corrected results, we could see that our weights, our attempts at correction actually generated very small difference. So, which basically means we have quite a stable, very nice file, which we couldn't call representative because that is not statistically true, but we can call trustworthy, reliable, at the very least. And I think that would be the end of my talk, my contribution on this occasion.
Thank you, Daniel. Maybe we should hand over to Harriet, either to comment on that or to move the conversation on to the next part.
Okay. I would like to follow up. I was going to be asking some questions about the comparative potentials of the survey, and I think this is a perfect segue into that. How does the methodology of the sampling of who's a Jew in the European Union and in this report compare to the Pew studies in the United States and in Israel? You do have comparisons of the European Union and United States and Israel in the report. How much can we rely on these? Are they using the same methodology to get to the sample of Jews that are in the survey?
The methodology is not really the same, although I must say that there is a growing reliance on the internet everywhere in the world. In the past, surveys were undertaken initially by face-to-face interviews, later by phone. It is proven that the people is a bit less collaborating. So the internet is a safer way. Of course, the internet is more biased than the other means. And as Daniel has said, we did an effort to correct some of those biases. By the way, what we found is that the results were the results. It was not the bias, it was the people. Look, there is a fundamental philosophical issue that we must keep in mind. The results exist and they are strong. Sometimes we don't like them, and we try to find the minutiae to explain that it is because of the technicality. No, it's not the technicality, it is the people, even if the people sometimes are really strange. But now let me just demonstrate some of those comparisons looking at part 3 of our presentation. We have 3 short comparisons where we put together Europe 2018, this is our effort, the US 2013 Pew survey, and the Israel 2015 Pew survey. And the first issue at stake is, again, the what is Judaism? Is it a religion, something else? And we find that there are certain differences between the areas. In fact, when the question is religion only, Europe is somewhat stronger than the other 2 areas. But and also when it is religion also together with other options. However, in all 3 areas, we find that the option ancestry is stronger than religion. And again, ancestry only or ancestry also, and of course they also can overlap. It can be religion for ancestry and ancestry for religion. And then there are other options such as ethnicity, which are not reported here. In fact, I find that the ancestry answers are extraordinarily similar in Israel, US, and Europe, in spite of the technical differences. It means, I think, something real about the Jews, give and take a few percentage points. But the fact is that religion is important, but there are other things that are more frequent among contemporary Jewry. Also religion, but fundamentally something else, which goes back to not really ethnicity, as I said, but something which flows with Jewish peoplehood, genealogy and history, and being part of something uninterrupted. The second slide, which is the next one, compares the why, that is some of the fundamental contents in the three major areas. And here we have focused on four. I immediately will make another comment, but the four are remembering the Holocaust, Jewish peoplehood, supporting Israel. In the case of the Israelis, it was actually living in Israel, which is not the same as supporting Israel from the outside. And then believing in God, observing Jewish law, the halakha. Well, again, with some variation, but you see clearly that the hierarchy, the ranking of these major four options is very similar. Indeed, in Israel, Jewish peoplehood is more present than elsewhere, whereas living in Israel is the weakest of the three, paradoxically. But we see that Holocaust is dominant, and then peoplehood. And then we also find, of course, that the state of Israel has become, willing or unwilling, an integral part of the definition of Jewish identity. This may be very troubling for some people, but we cannot deny that it's very difficult to remain indifferent facing the Israel variable. And then finally, the proper, more accurate participation in religious life is important, but it's held by a minority in each of these three areas. And then the next is more complicated, the next slide, because it attempts to look at the how, that is the lifestyle, the denominations, if you like. And here one conclusion is clear: there is not a majority lifestyle anywhere. Everywhere the Jewish people is fragmented. We have the Haredi Orthodox, which in this case we have merged. It is definitely stronger in Israel, somewhat weaker in the US, somewhat in between in Europe. Then we have a second bigger chunk of those who are traditional, whether in general or specifically thinking of the conservative movement in the United States. And then we have a third option, being sort of religiously defined, but along the reform progressive band. And here the US is clearly dominant, whereas in Israel, these movements have not really penetrated Israeli society. They are a very small minority. And in Europe, maybe not formally in terms of affiliation, but in terms of a certain propensity to declare that the preference to a Judaism, a formal organized Judaism, would be reform progressive. This is certainly one of the findings of our survey. In fact, it's slightly higher than the Orthodox and Haredi. And finally, there is the others, the just Jewish, the seculars, the unaffiliated, whatever you may call them. They are a very big chunk in Israel, the largest of them, and in Europe, quite similar. In the US, slightly less, because they perhaps the framework of America as a religious society. Let's not forget the US have the highest amount of people who declare that they believe in God and they are religious of most other Western countries. It also explains perhaps a higher tendency to be formally affiliated with a denomination. So this is one way to say that there are differences. The differences are not as spectacular as we might think. There are still more differences, and we shall see them in a moment. But this is something that certainly confirms there are regional influences, And of course, majority versus minority status are definitely important. But there is also an inherent logic of the Jewish system, which reproduces itself under any skies. And I think this is one of the most interesting conclusions, at least to me personally, as a comparativist. I find this fascinating because it means there is something that exists and something that can be researched and can be analyzed differentially.
Harriet, did you want to? You're on mute, Harriet. So I don't know if you wanted to come back.
I did. There are some other aspects of the comparative potential of this that I wanted to at least mention and ask you to comment on. And there you have in the report many comparisons between countries, which are fascinating. There's also comparisons between Jewish identity and national identity in each of the countries, which is also really fascinating. You have the comparisons between Europe, United States, and Israel, and you've given us a taste of those, but they go into more depth. I wanted to ask you if there were, in 2 minutes, some snapshots of some of these comparisons in addition to what you've already brought. What are the major challenges in doing these kinds of comparisons? Are there dimensions of comparisons that are not possible, that have been left out, that you'd like to see happen in the future? And whether you've thought about the possibility of expanding this to the global Jewish world and to doing more comparisons in Latin America, in Russia, and in Eastern Europe, and in the rest of the world, and if there's any movements in those directions.
Absolutely. I would like answering you to point to something which personally, everybody has its amount of craziness. This is the thing I like the most, and this is the next slide, which is the beginning of part 4. Part 4 comprises 2 slides. There is a technique which we call similarity structure analysis, which beyond the percentages and beyond any attempt to go into causality, describes the inherent structure of a certain set of variables. It is based simply on measuring the correlations between those variables, and people can say yes and yes to 2 things, or yes and no to 2 things. In the end, certain things are closer to others, and this can be presented in a very boring statistical correlation matrix, which is really illegible, or more nicely in a graphical presentation. The graphical presentation shows what's the logic of the identificational system, what is closer to what is central and what is more peripheral. So let's look at these interesting comparisons. In Europe, our 2018 survey indicated that while there are people who really believe in God and people who don't, and people who are devoted to charity and people who are devoted to culture, and they sometimes do not meet each other, there is something around which people can meet, and they can, though weakly, agree. And those things appear in the center. One is an interest, a support for the state of Israel as a form of being Jewish, a concern for Israel as a form of being Jewish. And the other is pertaining to a Jewish peoplehood, being part of a generic Jewish people. Not surprisingly, Israel and the Jewish people are quite proximate one to the other. In any case, this is the mental map of 16,000 Jews in Europe in 2018, and that's what you have. Now, interestingly, if you turn to the right, we did with Judit and other colleagues a big survey in Latin America. It was devoted to educators, indeed. It was not really a representative sample, but the mental map of those more involved Jews was quite identical. That is, at the center, this concern with Jewish peoplehood. I mean, this is the thing that most people would agree with, whether religious or not religious, whether involved or not involved with the community. And then in a kind of circular pattern, you find that anti-Semitism and Shoah occupy more or less the same spot. You find that tikkun olam and charity more or less find the same spot, and also community, family, and festivals more or less occupy the same spot. And then God is exactly where God should be. God is omnipresent, but in this particular diagram, it occupies the same spot on the right hand of the mental map. So that's Europe, that's Latin America, quite similar. Now the next slide is also interesting because it represents Israel, the 2015 Pew. And again, it is exactly the same pattern. Holocaust, on one hand, God stands quite at the opposite of Holocaust, and synagogue and friends stands where family stands elsewhere. And at the center, you have a certain sense of solidarity with the Jewish people. So these are the cynical Israelis, but still they understand still that there is a Jewish people to be part of. And now we move to the USA 2013 Pew. I haven't done yet this with the 2020, but I promise I'll do. And here, most of the map is again identical. God is where it should be, and responsibility, philanthropy, and charity. And then you have the holidays and the family exactly in the same spot, and the Holocaust where it should be. But there is a big but. There is no center. There is not a variable, which elsewhere is Jewish peoplehood, that sort of unifies the perceptions of the US Jews. And this is the big question mark. What is the variable that might occupy that central spot? Does it exist? We have exhausted all of the possible variables, and they are circularly plotted on the map. What is the center? What is the consensus? What is the common denominator? What is that point in which the different can converge and have a nice and dynamic conversation around a table? This is unclear to me. Perhaps it is being American. That's my first option, but maybe it is having a Thanksgiving dinner. That's also a favorite option. In any case, we have not asked the question, and so we have not obtained the answer. And so this brings me to the last part of your question, Harriet. There is a huge potentiality to improve our understanding if we can coordinate better our work, and we can run parallel studies in different parts of the world. Certainly Eastern Europe to this effect is a little bit understudied, although we have some evidence that it is interestingly not so different from the rest of Europe, from the partial evidence that we have. And there are parts that are somewhat obsolete. So this would call for a collaboration of a team, what I like to call the epistemic community, that is those who, while disagreeing here and there, but they agree that there is a way to do research together and to get to the depth of these quite fascinating comparisons and conclusions.
Thank you. I think I'll turn it back to Jonathan to continue.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm going to turn to some of the questions that have been coming in from people who are attending. There's one that I think I can probably deal with myself, which was just a question about the time frame of the data gathering. So the survey was in the field for about 8 weeks, and one of the interesting things about this method is that what tends to happen is that the people on the sort of affiliated lists tend to respond first, and the longer it's in the field, the more of the kind of the less affiliated or the unaffiliated or the kind of less engaged, whatever term we want to use, we pick up. So there's a case for kind of keeping these in the field for as long as possible. This was a study that was commissioned by the European Union, so we were working to their very tight deadline, so we couldn't keep it in the field for any longer than that. But I think that's one of the key pieces of learning we get from it. There are a bunch of methodological questions. I think, there's one from Anonymous, don't know who that is, obviously, about whether we picked up, or whether our findings represent the behaviours and values of unaffiliated Jews. I think we've talked about that quite a lot, although Bethany Horowitz asks the question about whether, notes that Pew used address-based sampling, and that's a more reliable approach than this networked approach. So maybe somebody wants to comment on that. Although I think we've dealt with methodology quite a lot. So I'm wondering whether we shouldn't go first for I think quite an interesting question, which is about the desecularization that we're seeing, and whether that's a product of assimilation of the just Jewish, or more to do with the birth rate of the traditional and Orthodox. So I've thrown quite a lot out there. If you want to respond to the methodological things, then feel free to do so. But maybe we can move on to other issues.
There are a couple of observations. Then I will leave to Daniel and to others. First of all, sorry, I totally disagree on the address-based methodology, which I think is very problematic. And I've personally written a long, friendly critique of the Pew 2020. It isn't that way that we solve the problem of a real sample. Of course, we are far, far away from the limitations of the list-based samples. We had no lists. As Daniel said, there is certain big amount of people who got the link to the internet through a Jewish organization. I insist on the A, because there are so many and so different Jewish organizations. But one thing that we have, and we have not shown tonight, is that among the younger, the younger the sample, the higher the proportion of the unaffiliated that we covered. So we are pretty confident that we got something which is true, and it's probably the tendency of many of the younger people not to be formally affiliated, although they manifestly present behaviors and attitudes that seem to be more traditionally Jewish than their parents and grandparents. So even if the statistics are not 100% accurate, I think we are hands-on the big trend. Another thing that we have in the major report, of course, you should read the major report, is that we did some lifetime comparisons. And so we were able to compare the how, that is how you live, are you more or less traditional at birth, how were you born, and how you define yourself now. So we were able to do some kind of real longitudinal survey, although it is not longitudinal technically, but we follow the same people at 2 points in time, when they were born and now, and we find extremely interesting findings. In fact, there is a tendency for many to become more religious lifetime. It's not just a comparison of separate age groups. It's the same persons who become more religious, they become more Orthodox, they also become more Reform, and they tend to become less generically just Jewish or traditional. There is therefore a transformation in the life of the younger generation to become more clearly oriented in terms of the options. And of course, the options are quite different, because a Haredi and a progressive are proposing two different things, but they are two Jewish things. And people like to be adherent to something which is more formal. So in one way or another, they do identify more clearly, more specifically with being Jewish. They declare themselves more strongly than they were born. And of course, Europe has always offered a strongly assimilating environment. And so this is, in a sense, a reaction. There is one last comment I wish to make. This comes from another report Dr. Staetsky and me have published recently, and that's more on the demography. We compared the proportion intermarriage among older and among younger people, and we found, to my extreme surprise, that the younger is less intermarried than the older. That is, there is a return home. I think this is the big message of the systematic research we have done at JPR. There is a systematic evidence about returning home on different accounts. My own explanation is that this is partly inherent because people want contents and validity in their inner spiritual life, and also a reaction to the hostile European environment that unquestionably raises questions of the politics of different countries and political parties, and of the public opinion, which on many accounts are very problematic. But I think the research findings are consistent and very strong. I repeat for the last time, perhaps surprising, and perhaps different from what we have in other parts of the world, namely the United States.
Thank you. I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to throw two questions out, both of which I think are quite interesting. One is from Suzanne Cohen-Weiss, who asks about whether there are any interesting differences between European countries or areas, for example, East-West, any surprising findings in certain countries or areas. And the other question from Michael Wieger is about denominations, and whether denominations are the best way of distinguishing between categories, and whether we considered other possibilities of I guess breaking up the sample in that respect.
Well, of course, starting from the end, denominations is not the best way, and in fact, the report thoroughly discusses the situation avoiding denominations and looking at different patterns of actual behavior and belief and preference. And then in the end, of course, you cannot totally avoid denomination. But then we find that the majority are non-denominational. And we also find that denomination preferred does not mean affiliation with that denomination. It's a kind of declaration of intents, which means I'm more traditional, I'm more modern. And so, yes, at that level, denominational labels are a very interesting and useful tool. Regarding the question on geography, unquestionably, we did not have the time tonight to debate that. There are at least 4 different patterns in Europe, which quite simply I will call the North, the South, the East, and the West pattern. And definitely in terms of religiosity, in terms of affiliation, in terms also of certain basic beliefs. We have a model of the former communist countries such as Poland, Hungary. We have a model of the northern countries, Scandinavia and the Netherlands, mostly together. We have the southern places, Italy, Spain, the Mediterranean coast. And we have the central Western Europe, France, Belgium, to some extent Germany and Austria. And they do emerge very clearly, and the UK also part of the West, as represented fundamentally first by different proportions of the Haredi Orthodox, which can range from 30-40% to virtually none, according to major parts of the continent. But also the willingness to declare yourself and to become more positive and more sort of self-declared outspoken Jew. And of course, also the reactions to anti-Semitism, which is quite significantly different in those different parts of the continent. Perhaps, Daniel, you want to add something about loyalty and about country versus the rest.
I could. I just wonder whether that's the most appropriate use of our time. I could add a few words about the attachments, if there is time for that, and I would like to ask the coordinators.
Yeah, just a few quick words, Daniel.
Yeah, so I would need slides for that. I cannot.
That's part 5. That's part 5.
That's part 5. Yes.
Presentation.
I think one aspect to highlight here, and we haven't covered it so far, is that alongside questions on denomination and also preferences and also various values and self-definition, we asked questions on the degree of attachment of Jews to different entities. And let me tell you that it wasn't a simple thing to do. The survey, the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights Survey, that we are reporting today, was conducted in 2018. The first survey was conducted in 2012, and that question on attachments was asked already then. And there was a significant degree of ambiguity in the research team about whether or not it is appropriate, how risky it is to ask this question. It has never been done. We're asking Jewish individuals, something as straightforward as how attached you are to your country, how attached you are to the European Union, how attached you are to Israel. What complicates this seemingly straightforward question is the uses, and mainly I mean political uses that can be made from it. We all know that one of the well-established, well-known anti-Semitic tropes, or at least anti-Jewish tropes, is that Jews are disloyal somehow. They have conflicting centers of loyalty. They only care about Israel, or they only care about Jews. They don't care about any other countries and countries in which they live, their host societies. So effectively, we had in our hands a tool, a way that would address that particular accusation or that particular question. So what we found as a result, and it's quite interesting for me to present it. This is the first time we're presenting that kind of material. I'm not aware that this was done anywhere before in the United States or in any other place. We asked Jews effectively for three questions: how strongly you attach to a country in which you live in, how strongly you attach to the European Union and to Israel. What you see in front of you is the left-hand side panel, shows you Jewish individuals that responded to our survey in comparison to non-Jewish individuals of various kinds. And what you see is that Jews who say that they're strongly attached to a country in which they live is approximately 40%, which we would characterize as a strong minority. We also can see that in that Jews are not very different from the total for these countries. So the question on a degree of attachment to a country was asked, has been asked, is being asked while I speak in different international surveys in Europe, that very question. And in Europe, non-Jewish individuals, about 43%, answer in a way that Jews answer. So the difference between Jewish individuals and non-Jewish individuals with respect to attachment to a country is really not that big. There's approximately, well, I would say negligible difference, if at all. We can also see, and perhaps this is understandable, that segments of populations, the European populations that are most strongly attached to their country are people who were born in that country, who don't belong to ethnic minorities in those countries, and who define themselves as Christians. On the other hand, on the other side of the spectrum, people who are ethnic minorities or non-Christian minorities who report lighter or weaker attachment to a country. So Jews sit quite in the middle and very close to the average. The attachment for Europe to European Union is on an entirely different scale. It's much weaker. That's very understandable than attachment to country. I would say, if I have to give a characterization across Europe, about 10 to 15% of people, we said here 13% in total, say that they're strongly attached to that entity, that political body that is called the European Union. With respect to Jews, the attachment is slightly higher, but I would not overinterpret that either. It's 19%. On that particular variable, by the way, there are differences between Jews in different countries. As a rule, in Eastern European countries, we could see, such as Poland and Hungary, Jewish individuals are more attached to European Union than what we see here, but on average is about 19%. I would go now to the next slide, arguably the most important slide, or the most interesting slide in this whole presentation, that shows the differences in attachment between of Jews to the country in which they live in and to Israel. So first of all, look at the levels of attachment to Israel. This is on the left-hand side. This is with respect to Jews only. We could see that the levels are very high in Southern Europe and Spain and France. They're somewhat lower in Eastern Europe. But anyhow, what we can see in the right-hand side is the comparison of the degree of attachment, strong attachment of Jews to Israel versus their attachment to country. And that right-hand side presentation graph is divided into two panels. the bottom and the top. At the top, we could see countries where Jewish attachment to a particular country in which they live is higher than it is than the attachment to Israel. And the countries that are featuring there are Denmark, France, United Kingdom, Poland, Hungary, and Sweden. In the next group of countries, which is an eclectic mix of Netherlands, Italy, Belgium, Spain, Austria, and Germany, attachment to Israel is somewhat higher than attachment to a particular country. What is very interesting for us to observe that at the bottom side, at the bottom part of the panel, so those countries where attachment to Israel is higher than it is attachment to a country, we find countries such as Germany and Belgium. And these are countries with inherently weak attachment to that particular country in Jewish and non-Jewish populations. So particularly in Belgium, this is a sort of a composite country with somewhat weak national identity. In Germany, the Jewish population of that country is relatively new, and 80% of this derives from Soviet Union, actually. So this is the way to explain this particular finding. I believe that in addressing this issue of potentially competing loyalties or competing attachments, we managed to take the sting out of the subject by showing, first of all, that there is no such a thing as competing attachments. Jews are very significantly attached to their countries. We can see that in many places, perhaps not in all, the attachment to these countries, to their host populations, is no different from the attachment to Israel. We could also show, finally, that this system, this, if you wish, competing or complementary attachments, is something that exists for other minorities, people who are not born in a particular country, people who are belong to ethnic and religious minorities, simply have more than one attachment, and these attachments can and do live quite harmonious lives in political lives of these individuals. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. That last comparative piece, I think, is really, really fascinating. And it would be interesting that just thinking about international comparisons, I think it'd be interesting to be able to see a similar picture in the States, in Canada, in Mexico, in Latin America, indeed Australia, South Africa. There's so much more, I think, that could be done around that. I was going to take 5 minutes to ask everybody what you thought in a couple of sentences needs to be done to improve the quality of our understanding of Jewish identity going forward. But I'm conscious that we've more or less run out of time. So I think we're going to skip that part. And all I would say to people watching is if you want more conversations about this, if you want us to go into more depth, we're more than happy to put on follow-up events where we get an opportunity to discuss these issues in greater depth. There's a huge amount in this report, and I feel like we've barely scratched the surface this evening. If you want to see the report, you can find it on our website. You can download it for free. That's www.jpr.org.uk. You'll see it there on the homepage, and as I said, feel free to download it. I'm just going to say a very brief thank you to everybody for participating. Apologies to people whose questions we didn't quite get to. We have a record of them, and we will certainly try to find other ways to address them over time. But I want to finish just by handing over to Judit. I promised you 5 minutes at the end, but we're only a minute away from the end.
No.
So Judit, I'll hand over to you just to say some
on this occasion. I'll do it lesser. Well, first of all, to thank. I'm very happy, really happy of this joint activity. I think that it reflects both of the shared will. You mentioned that you're a member of the board of the ASSJ. The shared will of building a transnational and also transdisciplinary epistemic community. We do have much to share, and this is the opportunity, right, to continue to develop joint debates, discussion, analysis. I want to add that, as you can clearly discover in my accent, I am a Latin American, right? An Argentine becoming Mexican through other parts of the world, of course, Israel too. But I think that is really a challenge, and we have been talking with Sergio for a long time how we can bring such a wonderful initiative to Latin America. The answer has to do with Latin America differing from European Union in many, many different aspects. Let me tell you, with my multiple identities, I am a member of the Scientific Commission of the European Union. And I really die of envy to see all the initiatives that in our region are not developed. I think that we have to see how so first it has to do with the continent, and second has to do with the last point that Daniel presented, and has to do with this imaginary attachment, being Jewish, sharing your condition with the national scene. So here, what I can just finish saying is that differing from letting the people say what they feel, we do have here really a very productive, I would say, formulation of researchers that we adjudicate to the people if they are Argentine Jews or Jewish Argentine. So this must come to an end. We have dealt with this, and saying that really, I still have many questions, many ideas. One of them is this intersection in between quali and quanti studies, because here we have an example that you are not labeling, but you are building conceptual and categories that allow you to interpret and to understand what people say. So having said so, I again appreciate this joint event, John, and I look forward my recognition to Sergio and to Daniel, and of course to my dear Harriet Hartman, and goodbye to everyone, right? That's my message. Shorter than ever, Jonathan. Write it, really.
Thank you, you did really, really appreciated. I'm just going to very quickly just say, because Harriet's prompted me to do so. She asked whether the data set is available for public use. It actually is. It's available from a facility that the European Union run called GESIS, which is spelled GESIS. And if you go there, you will find that data set, and actually you also find the previous data set from 2012. And to say that, actually, just to follow on from Judit, there is a third survey, multinational survey, the third in the series, scheduled for later this year, next year. So there'll be a third data set as well, which I think will allow us to track how things are changing a little bit over time as well. So that's coming. Just to repeat, thank you so much to everybody. Really, really appreciated. Thank you for everybody at home joining us. If you've got any comments or thoughts, feel free to email us, and we'd love to hear. But thanks again to everybody, and good night.
Well, bye-bye.